Hello, friends. I have dynamite. Hey, werewolf, help me. Wow, fire, it's fire. Anna and her father looked down at the bloody goat carcass on their porch in silence. It was the third of their livestock to be slaughtered that month. The bodies always ended up in front of the house. This one was closer than the others. They stood there for some time, side by side. Anna was a thin girl of 13 with dark blonde hair that hung down over her shoulders in limp curtains. Had she lived a different life, she probably would have been almost beautiful, but her face was hard and perpetually determined in an unnerving sort of way. It mirrored her father's. Her eyes were large, round and greyish-blue. They were alert but flat and somewhat calculating. The few folks in town who had had the rare chance of conversing with her found that it was somewhat unnerving to have those cold eyes look at you. They seemed to know just what you were hiding in your head. No pleasantries are necessary with this young woman. Her disposition made for a good farmer though, like her father. She was precise with her work and unbothered by the business of raising and slaughtering animals on the farm. Her eyes flicked up to her father. He, Jaeth, a mostly silent but not unkind man, turned his eyes, which were not at all flat, but fiery and golden brown, back to her. He nodded. They hauled the body to the backfield together, although one of them could have moved it alone. It was not a large goat, and it was missing its head and innards, which lessened the weight significantly. That night, they burned the goat's body in a pit that had become the designated burning spot. They didn't want to use the contaminated and mangled meat, and they didn't want any animals coming in and sniffing around after it, or maybe they didn't want whatever thing had been tearing up their livestock to come back. Either way, it felt like the right thing to do, and it had become a sort of ritual for them, one that each of them secretly felt was its own kind of ancient magic to ward off evil, or bad luck, or whatever it is that poor folks use to explain their misfortune. Anna's mother, Ellen, would watch from the window when they did this, her face a frozen mask of worry. She didn't like the woods and she didn't like killing. She did the housework and had planned on doing the child rearing, but there had only been one child, Anna, and Anna took care of herself. So, it was just Helen, hiding inside, keeping her mind busy as Anna and Jaeth did their duties every day, and now they're burning every night. That night Anna had a dream. She dreamed she was wandering through the woods near their farm, but everything was bigger. The brush was so thick she could barely push her way through. There was no path, just leaf-lined ground and trees so thick they blotted out the sunlight. She was frightened and every noise made her pause and wait. She felt that something was stalking her. She could smell it. It smelled like the burning goat, burning flesh. Then the pain started. It ran up her legs to her hip bones. It felt like every bone was splintering and trying to push through her flesh. She felt her arm bones go hollow like something was eating the marrow inside, sucking it out. Her body creaked like dry twigs and she screamed. She looked down to see her knees bending, agonizingly, backward, and her collarbone jutting out against her tightening skin. She knew somehow that her bones were gone, replaced by animal bones, bird bones, light, and brittle and sharp. She fell to the forest floor, the weight of the meat in her body cracking her new frail skeleton. Her fingertips were bleeding and she saw the tips of sharp talons pushing through her nail beds. The pain was like fire and she wished she would die, wished the darkening forest would take her fast so that the awful pain would stop. And then it did, and it was dark. She heard a voice in the blackness coughing and wheezing out the words. "Killing harvest. Harvest for the blood moon, child." Anna woke in her bed crying hot tears. her throat throbbing from her choked screams. She looked at her fingers, wanting, for one insane moment, to see the sharp talons, so that she might tear them down her face, and rip her eyes out. And then, the reality of the cold room brought her dream-drenched brain back to normalcy. Her face changed back to its normal state so quickly, it was as if she had never stirred at all. She just sat there on her bed, staring blankly at the window across the room at the half-moon that hung there, her hair clinging to the sweat on her forehead. Finally, she looked down at herself and saw that her underwear was drenched in blood. It was her first time. That morning, Anna grabbed her knapsack and her mother's grocery list from the kitchen and headed into town. She hadn't said a word to her mother about her supposed induction to womanhood. She had simply cleaned herself up and scrubbed the evidence out of her sheets and underwear as best she could. She wasn't surprised by the arrival of her first blood. She knew what it was all about, but it didn't seem like the kind of thing her mother would want to hear about. Change often upset her, so off Anna went with some tissues stuffed into her underwear and her usual determination to get the work of the day finished. She walked down the dirt road leading from the farm, looking down at her battered old work boots as she kicked rocks and worked her way towards the main road. Suddenly, a bloody mass of fur came into her sight line. She stopped, her boot only 6 inches away from it. She stopped and stared down at it. It was a cat, or rather it had been. Now it was hardly recognizable as anything at all. It was just a blob of black, blood-matted fur. She could only tell it was a cat because of the sharp teeth jutting out of a small, crushed head. One triangle ear still stood out on top. She felt ill at the sight of it. It wasn't a cat she had seen before, but its closeness to their farm made her uneasy. They were like psychotic gifts, left around the property for her and her family to find, or maybe she was just falling too far into her father's psyche. For all the stoicism her father had on the outside, he had just as much superstition and paranoia about the world rolling around on the inside. At night, when they stood by the fire, if there was something to be burned that night, he would tell her his theories. He had many, and they were not full of the kind of magic that Anna would have liked to hear. They were dark and violent ideas about what the world was really made of. He was not the kind of father who would tell you not to fear monsters in the closet. He would look you directly in the eye and tell you to be wary then, and maybe keep a knife under your pillow. Anna pulled her thoughts and her eyes away from the cat and moved on down the road. When she made it to town, she was reminded again of how secluded their lives on the farm were. She only came into town maybe once a month. Mostly they got on eating off the farm or had some things delivered. She looked around at all the entertainment, a movie theater, a comic book store, a small wooden playground in the park. They all seemed odd to her. The only thing she really liked to do for fun was read. It didn't seem there was time for much else, and although she didn't know it, her mind was far more mature than most people her age. She had bigger thoughts in her head than watching a cartoon movie about talking dogs or reading beauty magazines telling her how to get some model's look with 5 simple tips. She felt like an alien whenever she came into town. None of it made much sense to her. She went into the store to get her mother some soap and baking necessities. She got what she needed and briefly stopped in an aisle with feminine hygiene products, but didn't know where to begin to choose something or what to do with it if she did. She decided she would use the tissue technique until she asked her mother about it. She supposed that was inevitable and she would just have to deal with the awkwardness of that conversation. On her way out of the store, paper bag in hand, she nearly ran into a boy whose name she couldn't remember. She had seen him a few times when her mother used to take her to church. His parents own one of the big white Victorian houses on Main Street. She supposed they were rich, but that didn't mean much to her except that he and his mother and brothers probably didn't have daily work to do around the house, and they certainly didn't have to skip any meals. This boy was pale and soft with little sunken eyes that darted around as he talked. He looked at her chest several times during their brief conversation. She noticed men did that now, and she barely had much to speak of in the way of curves yet. She sometimes felt they were checking to see, or rather waiting to see when she would be ripe enough to see if she had turned woman yet. She supposed now she had, and wondered if this boy could smell it on her. "Have you heard about all the dead animals?" he said with a grin too wide for such a statement. Anna just stared at him. I said, "Have you heard about something killing all the animals? My daddy said there's a wolf or a bear or something roaming around out there in the woods, but my ma says it's the devil come to reap." "Reap?" she said, her eyes locked on his. "Yeah, you know, take from us for our sins. Punishment for what we are," he listed off, obviously parroting everything his mother told him. "And what are we?" she said, feeling lightheaded and wanting to run away from his moony cottage cheese face. "Humans. We're full of sin and lust. You know about that, right? My mom says girls are the most sinful, especially trashy little sluts like you," he said. He caressed one of her small, newly formed breasts and winked at her. He was laughing at her, sneering at her, perhaps thinking that he was really doing a fine and dandy job of making conversation on this lovely afternoon. "Oh, wait, that's right. My friend, Tim, says you farm folk only fuck animals. Is that right?" He actually laughed out loud at this. Her head felt like it was full of bees, and a veil of red fury slowly lowered over her field of vision. She dropped her grocery bag, raised her arm up and brought it back down with the swiftness of a cat, raking her nails across his cheek. It drew blood. The boy screeched and pushed her away. He clutched his bleeding cheek and backed away from her. He tripped over the curb and into the street and landed on his cushiony ass. Anna walked over to him calmly, silently, and brought her foot up and then down directly onto his genitals. He coughed out a dry scream, tears streaming down his face, rolling back and forth crying. "You are a bad person." He was crying like an infant, his face as red as a tomato, writhing in the street. Anna stood over him, one leg on each side of him, and leaned down into his face. He went silent immediately and looked up at her with eyes like saucers. She crouched down and looked at him, her nose only 3 inches from his. There wasn't a hint of anger on her face then, just cold, analytical curiosity. "We don't fuck animals. We slaughter them," she said. He whimpered. "Do you know how to use a knife?" No answer from him, just wide-eyed fear. "I do," she said. She pulled a hunting knife out of her boot. "I could bleed you dry with 2 cuts. Here and here," she mimed, slitting his throat and his stomach with the edge of the knife. He closed his eyes and promptly peed his pants. She stood up and gathered up her groceries. There were a few people standing on store stoops looking at her like she was some kind of beast. She looked back indifferently and then turned and walked home.